1944. Europe was on the brink. The war was no longer a battle of armies. It had become a contest of minds. Artillery and tanks could destroy cities, but they could not deceive fear. America understood. To defeat the enemy, you must make him see what isn't there. From this idea, a story was born that sounded like madness even to the generals. The command created a unit unlike any other in history. They were called simply the Ghost Army. And although on paper it was just the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, in essence, it became the quietest and most dangerous weapon of the Allies. They recruited not soldiers, but creators into this unit. Artists, engineers, architects, sound engineers, set designers from Hollywood, people who had built illusions all their lives. They were given uniforms, but not rifles. Instead of bullets, pumps. Instead of shells, speakers. Instead of blood, paint. Their commander, Colonel Ralph Inman, told them on the day of their arrival, "You will not shoot. You will make the enemy believe that a whole army is here. And if he believes, you have already won." They trained at an old airfield near London, away from the eyes of the Allies. In huge hangars, the first monstrous constructions were created. Inflatable tanks, plywood airplanes, mock-ups of bridges and artillery. Heavy pumps hissed in the darkness, and within hours a whole battalion rose from air and rubber on an empty field. Artists manually painted shadows on the hulls so that from the air the vehicles looked real. Radio operators invented fictional conversations, code names, and entire scripts of troop movements for the Germans to intercept. Sound engineers recorded the real noise of the front, tank tracks, shots, commands, even barking dogs. On the ground they created chaos that was impossible to distinguish from the real thing. Their first operation took place in France a few weeks after the Normandy landings. Real troops were moving towards St. Lo, and the Ghost Army received orders to divert German attention to the north. In one night, they deployed an entire camp. Tents, trucks, command tents, radio masts, even an improvised hospital. In the morning, German aerial scouts saw exactly what they were supposed to see, a huge division preparing for an offensive. A few hours later, artillery strikes and tank attacks fell upon it. Meanwhile, the real units advanced calmly on another sector where no one was expecting them. By morning, only holes in the ground and charred pieces of rubber remained of the camp. But the mission was accomplished. The Germans lost a day and thousands of rounds of ammunition attacking something that didn't exist. When one of the soldier decorators saw his tank burning and melting, he just said, "Great scene, pity there's no audience." For the first time in the entire war, the enemy was defeated not by force, but by art. From then on, the quote-unquote Ghost Army became a shadow moving behind the real army. They had no room for error. One exposed deception, and the entire unit would be destroyed. So they worked like actors, performing life and death live. Every step was calculated, every sound, every track on the road. Even fake tire tracks were left by hand, so German scouts would see where the, quote, division was moving. Soon, even the Allies began to fear them. When real units arrived in a town where the, quote, Ghost Army had already worked, the locals would say, "We saw your men. There were thousands of them." But no one saw any bodies or traces, only smoke, sound, and a mirage. Thus was born a legend that wasn't spoken of in newspapers or reports. Their missions remained secret. No one knew who these people were. Only the result spoke for itself. The enemy went where there was no one, and those who were really fighting survived, thanks to those who fought as shadows. And when the Germans first reported to headquarters that the Americans are using a new division that disappears after battle, in Berlin they decided it was an intelligence error. They did not yet know that from that moment on, they would have to fight not only an army of flesh, but an army of illusions. After the first successes, The quote, ghost army was no longer an experiment. Now it had become a weapon equal to a division. Their names disappeared from all reports. Their camps were not marked on maps. Their conversations were not recorded in archives. The command gave them one order: deceive the enemy by any means necessary. And they deceived, with an ingenuity unknown to any other army. In the French fields, among destroyed villages, the quote, ghosts learned to turn nothing into strength. In a few hours, they could turn an empty plain into a fortified base. Inflatable Shermans stood in rows, plywood howitzers cast fake shadows on the ground, and the emblems of non-existent units fluttered on flagpoles. Radio operators created chaos on the airwaves, conversations that never happened, orders that sounded confident but made no sense. One radio operator, a former musician, joked, "We are composing a symphony of war, and the Germans are dancing to our music." And indeed, the enemy listened. Wehrmacht intelligence recorded signals, photographs, observers' reports. Everything indicated that large forces were operating against them. Thus was born an illusion that worked without a single shot. The most famous operation was the Bethune mission. Real troops were advancing towards the front line, but the Germans expected them from the south. To divert attention, the Ghost Army moved north. In one night, they set up over 100 inflatable vehicles, installed sound systems, and laid cables to transmit command conversations. At dawn, the speakers began to drone with the sound of engines, the clanking of tracks, and the voices of commanders. The Germans heard it from 20 kilometers away. In their binoculars, rows of tanks were moving. Dust swirled over the road. Everything looked perfect. A few hours later, German artillery opened fire. The earth exploded. Shells tore through the air. The rubber tanks shuddered from the blast waves. Some were torn to shreds, but no one retreated. The people, hidden in trenches, simply waited for the Germans to expend all their ammunition. Meanwhile, the real army passed along the southern road without a single shot being fired. By evening, the enemy realized they had been firing at air. After the operation, the front commander said, "You are the only ones who can make the Germans spend shells on a shadow." These words became their highest reward. But this war had its own casualties. Once, when the Ghosts were setting up a camp in a field near the city of Metz, they were spotted by German aircraft. Strafing planes dove, dropping bombs on the tanks. People scattered, hiding under the inflatable hulls. When it was all over, black smoke rose over the field, and the rubber equipment slowly settled to the ground. One of the soldiers, a young artist named Bob Levin, said, wiping dirt from his face, "We are only half dead. The other half is air." And he picked up the pump again. Despite the danger, they did not stop working. Every day, every night, they devised new techniques. In one town, they set up a false headquarters with a radio station and even an actor impersonating General Patton. The uniform, gestures, habits, everything was rehearsed down to the smallest detail. German intelligence recorded Patton's presence and decided that the next strike would be there. As a result, the real offensive took place hundreds of kilometers away. The Germans began to go mad. Their officers demanded explanations: why the enemy appeared in several places at once, why columns disappeared, why airfields spotted in the morning were empty by evening. No one understood that they were fighting an illusion. Meanwhile, the Ghost Army moved on, from shadow to shadow. People lived between reality and falsehood. They wore no medals, received no letters, had no graves. In every town they appeared in, only silence and rubber remained. By the autumn of 1944, they had already conducted dozens of operations. Sometimes it seemed that their presence was felt more strongly than that of real armies. The Germans stopped trusting their own intelligence. Every binocular, every intercepted message could now be a trap. The world where the enemy feared not a bullet, but a sound, had finally become their theater. And then the command gave them a new order, the most dangerous one yet. Ahead was Operation Elba. They needed to convince the Germans that the Americans were preparing for a mass crossing of the river. In reality, there was no one there. This was to be their masterpiece, and perhaps their final performance. Operation Elba became the pinnacle of their skill and a test of survival. The goal was simple: to make the German command believe that the Allies were preparing to cross the river, thereby diverting troops from the real strike to the south. But the simplicity of this task was deceptive. In reality, the Ghost Army had to single-handedly stage an entire offensive. Where tens of thousands of soldiers usually operated, there were only 1,000 men, hundreds of pumps, dozens of speakers, and sleepless nights. It all started with silence. They arrived at the banks of the Elbe in late November, in a drizzling rain. The fields were empty, the water was gray under a heavy sky, and the air smelled of soot. A battle was raging somewhere in the distance. The wind howled between charred trees as the first trucks unloaded the inflatable Shermans. People worked without lights, in the dark, almost by touch. Each machine rose slowly, its fabric rustling dully. Within 6 hours, dozens of tanks stood along the bank, as if ready for a crossing. The radio operators turned on the voices, the creaking of engines, the clanging of metal, commands. Everything sounded as if an entire army corps was stationed there. Next, the artists went to work. They drew tank tracks on the wet ground, set up fake campfire lights, strung wire with fake helmets hanging on it, so that from the air it looked like a live position. Engineers installed dozens of microphones along the shore to amplify the sounds, creating the effect of thousands of voices. Every echo, every drop of rain became part of their performance. The Germans heard them at dawn. Radio interceptors reported, "The Americans are preparing a crossing. Activity is high. Tanks can be heard." The next day, reconnaissance planes took pictures. Along the bank, a whole army, camps, vehicles, depots. No one realized that half of the equipment weighed less than 100 kilograms. The enemy's response was instantaneous. The Germans moved an entire division, set up artillery, and began digging trenches. They were sure that one of the decisive battles would take place here. Meanwhile, the real American troops were calm. When the shelling ended, the field looked like a dead theater, charred skeletons, melted machines, wet earth smelling of sulfur. 8 people died, not many for an army, but for them, these were friends who held pumps, not weapons, in their hands. One of the surviving artists wrote in his diary, "We created an army from air, and now the air has taken its own." Despite the destruction, the operation was a success. The Germans spent thousands of shells in a full day holding a sector where there wasn't a single real soldier. The American command called it one of the most brilliant deceptions of the war. But the official reports did not mention the participants' names. They were forbidden to tell even their families about their service. After the Elbe, the Ghost Army became a legend that no one knew about. They moved through Europe, leaving traces of mirages in their wake. Sometimes they worked right in the midst of battles, just a few kilometers from the front line, creating the sounds of battles where there were none. Every day they saw death, but their task was not to kill, but to persuade. The closer the Allies got to Germany, the more often the ghosts were thrown in where time needed to be won. They became an invisible shield that doesn't shine in the sun, doesn't shoot, but saves lives. And when the music of victory was already sounding over Europe, these people were still pumping air into rubber tanks, knowing that their story would end without a salute or a parade. They were the artists of war, people who painted salvation while others shot. And every time a German officer reported, "The enemy is preparing for an offensive," somewhere in the darkness a man with a paintbrush in his hand smiled, because he knew the enemy was not seeing him, but what he wanted to show. And that was their strength, not in weapons, not in sound, but in the ability to make the enemy believe. Spring 1945. Germany was collapsing under its own weight, but the Ghost Army still moved forward, not for glory, but to finish the game they themselves had taught the enemy to play. They operated almost mechanically now, without sleep, without conversation, knowing that each of their operations brought silence closer. Behind them were cities that their last assignment was at the Ruhr River. The situation was critical. German troops were entrenched on the western bank, expecting a major offensive. The American command tasked the Ghosts with distracting the enemy, creating the illusion of approaching tank divisions. This was to be the final act, the last deception before the end of the war. They arrived at night. A wet wind stirred the grass, and in the distance, beyond the horizon, real artillery thundered. In the darkness, they began their familiar craft again. Dozens of machines made of fabric and air grew in the empty field. People set up loudspeakers, strung wires, painted tank tracks on the ground. The air smelled of rubber and gasoline, the aroma of their strange trade. One of the artists, tired and silent, said quietly, "We are not making a lie. We are building hope. If they believe in us, our guys will survive." By morning, the camp came to life. The roar of engines, radio chatter, the smoke of campfires, everything was thought out to the smallest detail. The Germans, dug in on the opposite bank, observed through their optics, reporting to headquarters, "The Americans are preparing to cross. Tank columns are lined up. Trucks are arriving constantly." Panic broke out at the Wehrmacht headquarters. They moved artillery, began mining bridges. Meanwhile, the real troops were already bypassing them from the north. But this time, the performance cost them dearly. The Germans launched a counterstrike on the camp. Shells fell one after another. The field burst into flames. The rubber melted and exploded. People ran, covering their heads with their hands, hearing bombs exploding nearby. That day, 24 people died, more than in the entire previous campaign. But they did not retreat. The commander shouted, "Don't turn off the sound. As long as the radio is working, they believe we are alive." And the microphones continued to transmit the drone of engines, even when only smoke and darkness remained around. When the artillery fell silent, the smell of burnt rubber and wet earth remained. Charred pieces of tanks stood over the field. Between them, burnt-out speakers, shreds of cables, and people who had not left. They sat in silence, watching the sun rise over the horizon. One of them said, "That's it. The end of the war." A week later, Germany capitulated. There were no parades for the Ghost Army. Their names were not announced on the radio or in the newspapers. They returned home, some to New York, some to California, some to farms where they had long been awaited. No one knew where they had served. In the documents, next to their names, it said "Secret Mission." Only 40 years later did the truth come out. Then, already gray-haired and almost forgotten, the former artists and engineers gathered again. On one of the rubber Shermans, restored for a museum, someone wrote, "We created an army from air, and with it, we saved the living." Historians calculated Thanks to their deceptions, the Allies avoided tens of thousands of casualties. Not a single bomb fell where the Ghost had drawn their camps. And when a German officer after the war saw photographs of their inflatable vehicles, he said, "If I hadn't been there myself, I wouldn't have believed it was possible. We lost not because you had more tanks. We lost because you knew how to make us see what wasn't there." These words became their reward, not of metal, but of memory. They faded into the shadows, where they had lived all through the war, and only decades later did the world learn that the victory in Europe was born not only from steel, but also from imagination. Americans always believed that strength was muscles, weapons, fire. But the Ghost Army proved that sometimes the strongest weapon is the ability to make the enemy believe a lie that saves the truth. And when the fabric of an old inflatable tank rustles in the wind, it seems that somewhere in the distance, the drone of those engines still sounds, an echo of a war in which illusion defeated reality.